Ecosystem superheroes. Sea otters help keep coastal waters in check. James Estes is an American marine biologist. He has studied wildlife in the North Pacific Ocean for the past 45 years. During that time, he has showed how predators change their environments. Ecosystems are made up of many organisms. They have complex relationships with each other. A trophic cascade is when a top predator is added or removed from an ecosystem. This changes the population of its prey and other organisms. Trophic cascades are a powerful and important force. They shape the natural history of our planet. Yet, human activity is continuing to impact wildlife populations. We are creating trophic cascades with unexpected consequences. Estes knows this firsthand after studying sea otter populations in the North Pacific. Sea otters were once hunted for their fur. Estes has spent most of his working life in the isolated Aleutian Islands. They stretch across the North Pacific Ocean from Alaska to the coast of eastern Russia. The islands might seem isolated, but humans have had an influence. Beginning about 200 years ago, hunters moved into the Aleutians looking for sea otter pelts. The animals once thrived there. Back then, there were hundreds of thousands of otters. The sea otter is a member of the weasel family. It stays warm in the water because it has the densest fur in the animal kingdom. There are about 850,000 to 1,000,000 hairs per square inch. This keeps otters insulated from the cold. However, the sea otter's thick, rich pelt also made it a major target for fur hunters. By the 1900s, hunters had brought the animal close to extinction. Only about a dozen colonies survived. Then came an international ban on sea otter hunting. This saved the animal from extinction. Studying sea otter habitat. Sea otters have a massive appetite. An adult animal needs to consume vast amounts of food to survive. It needs to eat about a quarter of its own body weight every day. This could be up to 11 kilograms, 24 pounds of food. Sea otters mainly eat sea urchins. They also eat crabs and other shellfish. Sea otters open these sea creatures with flat stones. Estes wanted to know what happened to the ecosystem after sea otter populations declined. So he began studying the sea floors around the islands where the sea otters had survived. He also studied areas where they had disappeared. Islands without sea otters had huge urchins that littered the barren sea floor. The underwater forests of kelp that once grew there had disappeared. The urchins consumed every kelp plant in sight. Our results were eye-opening, he says. By contrast, kelp flourished on nearby islands where sea otters survived or had been reintroduced. Estes found similar results elsewhere. Islands with sea otters had healthy kelp forests. Islands without otters had barren sea floors littered with sea urchins and no kelp. In removing sea otters from the North Pacific, humans had endangered the species. They had also disrupted a large chunk of the Pacific marine environment. The keepers of kelp forests. Sea otters are a keystone species. These important species that ecosystems depend on. Sea otters keep the kelp forest ecosystem healthy. This helps local species, as kelp forests support fish, mussels, and microorganisms. Kelp forests also help the global environment. Human activity is leading to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This causes an increase in global temperatures. Carbon dioxide is also absorbed by the ocean, making it more acidic. This harms many species. Yet kelp forests use carbon dioxide to make their own food in a process called photosynthesis. Estes has calculated that healthy kelp forests have the capacity to absorb billions of kilograms of carbon. Sea otter numbers and the threat of killer whales. Fortunately, sea otters were saved from extinction, or at least it seemed that way in the 1980s and 1990s. Then Estes made a second disturbing discovery. He returned to the Aleutian Islands of Adak and Amchita. There, sea otters' numbers had been steadily rising, but now he found their populations were dwindling. Estes looked elsewhere in the same chain of islands. He found that some sites still had healthy populations. They included the islands of Clam Lagoon on Adak. However, most others showed population declines. He calculated that about 40,000 sea otters had disappeared in a few years, and when sea otter numbers dropped, urchins reappeared. Kelp forests began to disappear again. Estes and another scientist, Tim Tinker, determined that killer whales were eating sea otters. Estes looked at the history of other species in the region. He discovered that when killer whale populations targeted an animal species, the population dropped. This happened with sea otters in the 1990s. It happened with seals and sea lions in the 1970s and 80s. Why? Estes determined that commercial whaling after the Second World War was the cause. Before commercial whaling, killer whales fed on great whales of the North Pacific and southern Bering Sea, says Estes. By the time commercial whaling stopped, there were virtually no great whales for killer whales to eat. So they expanded their diets first to seals, sea lions, and then sea otters. With the addition of killer whales, it seems a new top predator has appeared in the ecosystem. This shows how viewing the food web from the top to bottom allows us to better understand nature and its complex relationships.